A raven does not choose sides. It circles above a battlefield long before the battle is lost, and it is still circling long after the victors have gone home to forget what they did to win. The old world believed the raven did not simply watch. It remembered. Two birds sat on the shoulders of the highest of all kings, one carrying thought, the other carrying memory, and every morning they left him, and every evening they returned, bringing back the one thing a throne can never provide on its own: the truth of what is actually happening, both beyond the walls and within them. Centuries later, on a frozen frontier at the edge of an empire that stretched further than any map could hold, a man sits alone in a tent, long past midnight, ink freezing at the tip of his pen. He commands 400,000 soldiers. He holds the fate of nations he will never live to see. Outside the canvas walls, the empire he built sleeps under his protection, certain that nothing could touch it while he stands watch. Somewhere beyond the tree line, an enemy he has not yet named is waiting for morning, and still none of that is what keeps him awake tonight. And in the dark, by a dying candle, he is not writing to his generals. He is not drafting laws or plotting the ruin of his enemies. He is writing to himself. The same instruction, night after night, like a man trying to catch something that keeps slipping through his own fingers. Do not be tossed about. Do not be disturbed. Endure. If the most powerful man alive cannot simply obey his own orders, what exactly does his power actually control? History remembers him as Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome. He did not write his private notebook, the one we now call Meditations, so that history would remember him at all. He wrote it because he was losing a war no army could help him win, the war against his own mind. This is where the story of kings begins to come apart. We are taught early and often that power means the ability to make other people obey you, that a king is powerful because a single word from his mouth can move armies, end lives, redraw borders on a map. It is a clean definition. It is also almost entirely a lie, because history is littered with men who commanded everything and controlled nothing at all. Long before Rome, a philosopher in Athens tried to warn everyone about exactly this. Plato spent much of his life arguing that a just kingdom could only be led by one very specific kind of man, not the strongest, not the richest, not the most feared, a philosopher. Not because philosophers are clever with words, but because only a mind that has already learned to govern its own hungers can be trusted to govern anyone else's. Everyone laughed at the idea then. Almost no one has stopped laughing at it since. Look at what happens when the warning goes unheeded. Alexander wept, not from grief, not at first. Legend holds that he wept upon hearing there might be other worlds beyond his own, worlds he had not yet conquered. By 30, he had done what no general before him had ever done. He erased the borders of the known world and rebuilt them in his own image, and still, something in him remained unclaimed, ungoverned, hungry in a way no province could ever feed. A philosopher born centuries later, Arthur Schopenhauer, would describe this exact hunger, desire, he wrote, does not end when it is satisfied. It simply produces a new desire to replace the one it just devoured. Alexander drank more. He trusted less. He executed friends over rumors whispered by men who wanted his throne for themselves. He died at 32 in a foreign palace, and the empire he built did not outlive him by more than a few years, because he had built an empire of land and never built an empire of self-command. And an empire with no internal order collapses the instant the man holding it together lets go. Contrast that with a boy who never wanted the throne at all. Marcus Aurelius did not seize power. It was arranged for him decades before he ever wore it, by a predecessor who saw something rare in him. Not ambition, but restraint. When the throne finally arrived, he did not celebrate. He wrote to himself about the burden of it, the exhaustion of it, the temptation to become cruel, simply because cruelty was now so easy and no one alive could stop him from indulging it. Every night, on campaign, in the cold, he trained the only army that actually mattered to him, the one inside his own skull. 2 men, 2 crowns. One empire that unraveled within a single generation of its founder's death. One empire remembered 2,000 years later, not for the size of its borders, but for the calm of one exhausted man's handwriting. Here is the part no one likes to hear. The throne does not corrupt a man. It simply removes the excuses that were hiding him. Before Nero was Nero, he had a tutor, Seneca, a Stoic philosopher, a brilliant writer, a man who understood self-mastery as well as anyone in the ancient world. Spent years trying to shape the boy into an ideal ruler. For a while, astonishingly, it almost worked. Rome enjoyed years of competent, even generous rule. And then the raw material underneath the education began to win. Absolute power did not install cruelty in Nero. It simply removed every obstacle that had been quietly restraining a cruelty that was already waiting inside him. A king with no mirror does not become a monster. He simply stops needing to hide that he already was one. Seneca, the teacher who once believed he could build self-command in another man from the outside in, was eventually ordered by his former student to end his own life, and did so, it is recorded, with the same composure he had spent a lifetime writing about, which raises an uncomfortable question, and it is not really about kings at all. What would you do if nothing could stop you? There is a man in Roman history who arrived at that same question from the opposite direction entirely. Not a ruler who lost himself in power, but one who chose deliberately to disappear from it. Diocletian did something almost no Roman emperor before or after him ever did. At the height of his power, he simply walked away from it. He abdicated the throne and retired to a quiet estate on the Adriatic coast, where he spent his remaining years growing vegetables with his own two hands. When the empire began collapsing into civil war without him, desperate men rode out and begged him to return, to take back the crown, save the state, resume the throne he had built from nothing. The story survives that Diocletian looked at them and said that if they could see the cabbages he had grown with his own hands, they would never ask a man to trade this for power again. It is one of the strangest sentences a Roman emperor ever left behind, and one of the most honest. A king who discovered something more commanding than a throne, the ability to walk away from one. There is an idea buried in the work of a man almost everyone misquotes, and almost no one has actually read, that explains precisely why Alexander shattered and Diocletian walked free. A Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Jung spent much of his career studying an unseen half that every person carries, the impulses, appetites, and furies, too uncomfortable to look at directly. So instead we bury them, deny them, and project them outward onto enemies. Rivals, entire nations. He called it the shadow. A man who never confronts his own shadow does not become free of it. He becomes ruled by it quietly, invisibly, and calls that rule his own free decision. The tyrant is rarely a man in full control of his darkness. Far more often he is a man being piloted by it, insisting the whole time that his hands are the ones on the wheel. History calls these men villains. Jung would have simply called them unfinished. This is why a throne is such a dangerous place to discover who you really are. There is no longer anyone left standing between you and the answer. Nietzsche, writing centuries after the ravens had stopped circling Rome, is remembered today for a phrase almost everyone quotes and almost no one understands: the will to power. Popular culture flattened it into a slogan for domination: conquer, crush, win. But Nietzsche was not writing a manual for defeating other people. He was obsessed with something far harder: the discipline required to defeat and rebuild yourself over and over, becoming something greater than the version of you that woke up this morning. His ideal was never the man who rules an empire. It was the man who has done the far harder work of ruling himself, which brings the story to its strangest paradox. The freest man in the Roman world was, on paper, property. Epictetus was born into slavery, owned for a time by a secretary in Nero's own court. And it is said his leg was broken by a master testing whether he would flinch. He owned nothing, not even his own body, for most of his early life. And yet Epictetus went on to teach, more clearly than almost anyone before or since, that no one, not a master, not an emperor, not fate itself, could ever touch the one territory that actually mattered. his own judgments. Chain the body, he said, and the mind can still walk free. Meanwhile, in the palace above the house where he served, an emperor with unlimited armies could not survive a single night without being ruled by his own fear. A slave freer than his emperor. An emperor imprisoned by his own throne. Read that again. If it did not unsettle something in you the first time, and then there is the man history turned into a villain for describing power, too honestly. Machiavelli did not invent cruelty in politics. He simply refused to look away from it, and wrote down exactly what he saw with a clarity the world has never quite forgiven him for. Everyone remembers The Prince, the ruthless little handbook on how power is actually seized and kept stripped of every comforting illusion. Almost no one remembers that the same man also wrote at length in praise of shared rule, civic virtue, and the fragile discipline it takes to keep a republic from collapsing into one tyrant's hands. Machiavelli was not teaching men how to become monsters. He was showing them, with brutal precision, exactly how monsters get made, so the ones reading closely enough might recognize the pattern before they became it themselves, or before someone else did, standing over them. Underneath the reputation is something almost no one draws out. A man who understands his own nature clearly without flinching is far harder to manipulate than a man who insists he has no darkness at all. Modern psychology, several centuries and countless research papers later, keeps arriving back at roughly the same place the Stoics reached with nothing but a wax tablet and discipline. Power, researchers now find, tends to quietly erode the very empathy that helped a person earn it in the first place. The same mechanism the old philosophers once described as the shadow slowly swallowing the man. Give an ordinary person a small amount of unchecked authority, and the erosion often begins almost immediately, quietly. The same way rust begins, long before anyone notices the color changing. Nothing about the human mind has changed since Rome. Only the size of the thrones has. So what, then, actually separates a king from a tyrant? If it isn't the size of his army, the width of his empire, or the number of heads bowed in front of him, it is a space. A narrow, almost invisible space that the Stoics located over 2,000 years ago, and that still exists right now, somewhere inside you. The space between what happens to you and what you choose to do about it. Epictetus called it the only territory a person actually owns. Everything else, other people's opinions, fortune, fate. The raw material life happens to hand you was, in his words, never yours to control in the first place, and wasting a life trying to control it anyway was the surest road toward becoming exactly the kind of tyrant this story has been circling since the very first sentence. Aristotle once tutored a young prince who would grow up to conquer the known world and still die unsatisfied. And what he tried to teach that prince was never really about conquest at all. Character, Aristotle believed, was never something a person simply had. It was something built, the same way a blacksmith forges an edge onto raw metal, through repetition, through the quiet accumulation of 1,000 small choices. No one else was watching. A man does not become disciplined by wanting to be disciplined. He becomes disciplined by repeating disciplined actions until the action stops feeling like a choice at all and starts feeling instead like who he simply is. Alexander absorbed everything. His tutor taught him about strategy, and almost nothing he taught him about himself. The crown was never the point. It was never really on anyone's head to begin with. The real throne is internal, a seat of attention constructed slowly out of patience, self-honesty, and the willingness to look directly at the parts of yourself that most people spend an entire lifetime carefully avoiding. Alexander never found it, and drowned trying to fill the space where it should have been. Nero never looked for it, and let something older and hungrier sit there instead. Marcus Aurelius spent every freezing night on the frontier trying to build it, one exhausted sentence at a time, knowing he would never finish. Diocletian found it late, and the moment he did, he understood a throne was the smaller of the two kingdoms available to him, and he chose the larger one without looking back. You do not need a crown for any of this to apply to you. Centuries later, philosophers would give this same old struggle a new name. They called it existence preceding essence. The uncomfortable idea that no one arrives in the world preloaded with a fixed character, a destiny, an excuse. You are not simply handed a self and told to defend it. You build one, choice by choice, and you are responsible. Whether you ask for the responsibility or not for what you build, that is either the most terrifying sentence in this entire story or the most liberating one. Most people never decide which. The ancient kings never had that luxury. Neither, in the end, do you. The war for the throne inside your own mind did not end with the Romans. It simply changed uniforms. The invading army today does not arrive on horseback. It arrives as a notification, a craving, a grievance dressed up as a fact, an opinion you never actually chose, but now defend as though it were your own flesh. It arrives as the comparison you never agreed to make between your own unremarkable Tuesday and the curated highlight reel of a stranger you will never meet. Whoever or whatever currently occupies that narrow space between what happens to you and what you do about it. That is your true ruler, whether or not you have ever admitted it to yourself. Every morning in the old story, two ravens left the side of the highest of all kings and flew out into the world. One carrying thought, the other carrying memory. And every evening they returned and whispered into his ear the truth of everything they had seen, including always the truth about him. They called him the All-Father, ruler above every other god in his world. And still, he could not rule anything at all until his own mind had left his body, flown out alone into the world, and come back changed. Somewhere right now your own ravens are circling. They have been watching you long before this sentence began, and they will still be circling long after it ends, carrying back the same two things they have always carried: what you have done, and what you have spent years refusing to remember. No empire in history has ever been able to answer the only question that is actually left. When they land on your shoulder tonight and whisper what they saw, will you be able to listen?